The rain fell in sheets against the black marble, soaking the carefully pressed coats of mourners gathered around the grave. I clutched my mother's silk scarf, the one that still held the faint ghost of her vanilla perfume, as her coffin descended into the earth. My chest felt hollowed out, as if something fundamental had been carved away, leaving only a raw, pulsing ache. I searched the crowd methodically, my eyes moving from face to face. Cousins I hadn't seen in years. Family friends offering hollow condolences. My mother's colleagues wiping tears. But there was no sign of him. No sleek black car. No figure in a tailored suit. No apology. No explanation. My father had abandoned my mother during the final weeks of her battle with cancer. He had left her in a hospital bed, her body betraying her, while he disappeared with his mistress, a woman 15 years younger, with sharp cheekbones and sharper ambitions. For 6 months, I had watched my mother waste away, and for 6 months, I had covered for him. He's dealing with the stress in his own way, I'd tell her when she asked. He'll come around. He never did. The funeral director approached, speaking in low, respectful tones about burial plots and flowers. I nodded numbly, my mind fracturing into pieces. That's when my phone vibrated in my pocket. A text from an unknown number, a photo, actually, an image that would change everything. It was him, my father, in sunglasses and an open linen shirt, one arm draped possessively over her shoulder. They stood on the bow of a yacht, the Mediterranean sparkling behind them. He was laughing, genuinely, brilliantly laughing, with the kind of abandon I hadn't seen from him in decades. She held a champagne flute, her head tilted back in delight. The timestamp read today, 2:47 p.m., while my mother's coffin was being lowered into the ground. I dropped the phone as if it had burned me. My legs nearly buckled, and I reached for the nearest gravestone to steady myself. The world seemed to tilt sideways. The scarf in my other hand felt suddenly suffocating, like a noose. Clara, are you all right? My aunt appeared beside me, concern creasing her forehead. I managed a thin smile, the same smile I'd been perfecting since childhood, the mask my father had trained me to wear. Just the reality of it all, I whispered. But that wasn't true. The reality was something far more crystalline and dangerous. In that moment, something shifted inside me. The grief didn't disappear. Instead, it calcified into something harder, sharper, more focused. It became purpose. My name is Clara Bennett. And in that moment, I made a choice. He would pay for this, not with screaming or accusations or the desperate pleas of a wounded daughter. He would pay with precision, with patience, with irrefutable truth. He would pay slowly. The following 8 months were a masterclass in meticulous planning. I returned to my apartment, a modest one-bedroom in downtown that my mother had helped me lease, and began the work of transformation. I converted my spare room into an office. Filing cabinets lined the walls. A large cork board dominated one corner, covered with photographs, documents, and red string connecting various data points, like a detective's case file. The first step was accessing my mother's estate as her only daughter, and with the will explicitly naming me as executor. This proved straightforward. What wasn't straightforward was what I discovered within. My mother had been wealthy, not lavishly so, but comfortably affluent from her career as a publishing executive and from a modest inheritance from my grandmother. Over the years, she and my father had accumulated significant assets together, but someone had been bleeding those assets dry. I sat at my desk one night, spreadsheets illuminated on my laptop screen, and felt the cold fire of certainty settle in my bones. My father had been systematically transferring funds to offshore accounts held jointly with her. He'd falsified loan documents, claimed fraudulent business expenses, and systematically emptied accounts my mother had no knowledge of. The scale was breathtaking. Over 2 years, he'd stolen nearly $1.8 million. I leaned back in my chair, breathing slowly, methodically, I didn't scream or cry. I simply added the figure to my master document and moved on. Next came the harder work, building an unassailable case. I hired a forensic accountant named David Chin, a man with 30 years of experience and a reputation for discretion. I met him in a coffee shop far from my neighborhood where no one I knew would see us. I brought him a leather portfolio containing statements, receipts, and transfers. His eyes widened as he reviewed the material. This is... He paused, choosing his words carefully. Quite comprehensive fraud. Can you prove it in court? I asked. Without question, he said quietly. In fact, I'd say the evidence is almost too clean. Someone wasn't trying very hard to hide this. That made sense. My father had always relied on charm and intimidation rather than genuine cunning. He'd assumed no one would look closely enough. He'd assumed I would remain the frightened, compliant daughter he'd shaped through decades of subtle manipulation. I hired a private investigator next, a woman named Sarah Okonkwo, who came with references from a domestic violence shelter. I didn't need her to follow my father. I needed documentation of his affair, his timeline, his patterns. I needed photographs, dates, locations. I needed proof that he had abandoned a dying woman to pursue his mistress across the globe. What's your endgame here? Sarah asked during our first meeting, sitting across from me in a neutral office space. I met her eyes steadily. The truth. She studied me for a long moment, then nodded. All right, I can work with that. Over the next 6 months, Sarah provided me with a detailed dossier. Photographs of my father and his mistress, named Vanessa, at restaurants, hotels, the yacht club. Credit card statements showing expenses under assumed names. Flight records. Proof that he'd spent the final 2 weeks of my mother's life in the Caribbean. I organized everything meticulously. I created a color-coded system. Blue for financial crimes, red for affair documentation, yellow for testimony from family friends and medical staff who could speak to my mother's deterioration, green for his lies to family members about business trips and client meetings. I also began something else, something quieter but equally important. I reached out to people. My mother's best friend, Eleanor, was devastated when I told her the truth about the affair. She'd been there the day my mother learned about Vanessa. She could testify to my mother's heartbreak and my father's callousness. My mother's lawyer, Patricia, was appalled when I showed her the evidence of financial fraud. She became an ally, helping me understand the legal implications and the best way to proceed. Even my father's own business associate, Richard, grew willing to talk. He'd grown uncomfortable with my father's conduct years ago. The affairs, the lies, the way he treated business associates. Richard had his own documents, his own concerns about suspicious transactions that predated Vanessa. And then there was my half-brother. Julian was my father's son from his first marriage, a man 7 years my senior who had always enjoyed a privileged position in my father's eyes. Where my father dismissed me with cold indifference, he fawned over Julian. Julian had inherited that narcissistic charm, that casual cruelty. He'd spent our childhood making me feel small, insignificant. I almost didn't reach out to him, but I realized something important. Julian had his own grievances with our father. My father's recent affair had embarrassed him socially. Colleagues made jokes. His ex-wife had leverage in custody disputes because of my father's behavior. And perhaps most importantly, Julian had discovered that my father planned to leave the bulk of his estate to Vanessa, cutting both of us out almost entirely. He's an absolute bastard, Julian said over drinks one evening. He said it with anger, yes, but also with something else. Recognition, perhaps. The realization that he'd never been loved, only indulged. That the moment he stopped being useful, he too would be discarded. I know, I said quietly, and I'm going to prove it to the world. Julian looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in years. You're serious? Completely. He was quiet for a long moment, then slid a folder across the table. These are emails between him and Vanessa. I found them by accident on his laptop last month. You need these. I took the folder without comment. This was the moment I'd learned to expect in all my research and planning. The moment when people felt the urge to confess, to join, to participate in the reckoning. They were tired of the lies. They were ready to be unburdened. By the end of the 8th month, I had constructed a perfect mosaic of truth. Every piece fit. Every document corroborated another. The story was clear, comprehensive, and absolutely devastating. Now came the final phase, execution. The Hartwell Charity Gala was the largest social event of the season in our city. Held annually at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, it benefited the Children's Cancer Research Foundation. My mother had been on the board. She'd attended this gala for 15 years. My father, of course, had arranged to be on the guest list. He and Vanessa planned to make an appearance, to display their triumph, to remind everyone of his power and charm. I made my arrangements carefully. I contacted the gala's director, Margaret Hartwell, a woman who had known my mother well. I didn't tell Margaret everything. I simply asked if there was a moment in the evening when I could make a brief statement about my mother's legacy and her support of the foundation. "Of course, dear," Margaret said warmly. "We always reserve time for speakers. Would you like to share some memories?" "Something like that," I said. I also reached out to 3 influential guests, people I knew my father respected and whose opinions mattered to him. A city councilwoman, a venture capitalist, a judge. For each of them, I provided a detailed, bound portfolio containing the financial evidence, the photographs, and a simple letter. These documents speak for themselves. I wanted you to have them before tomorrow's gala, so you could make your own informed decisions about your association with this individual. I didn't ask them to do anything. I simply provided information. What they chose to do with it was their own decision. I also contacted a journalist I knew, Michael Torres from the city's most respected newspaper. I gave him the same materials along with a simple request. I want you to consider this a tip. Nothing goes to print until after the gala tomorrow evening, but I think your readers deserve to know the truth about what's happened. Michael, a man with a reputation for rigorous fact-checking, reviewed everything carefully. When I met with him 2 hours before the gala, his expression was one of measured fury. "This is one of the most brazen cases of financial fraud I've seen in years," he said quietly. "And the cruelty of the timing during his wife's illness is unconscionable." "Yes," I agreed. "It is." "I'll be there tomorrow," he said. "I need to hear this in person." The Grand Metropolitan glittered with elegant excess. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across the ballroom. Tables were draped in white silk. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Waiters circulated with champagne and canapes. I stood in my mother's favorite color, deep emerald green, my hair swept into an elegant updo. I wore pearls at my throat and her diamond watch on my wrist. I looked at myself in the ballroom's mirror as I arrived, and for the first time in 8 months, I felt the weight lift slightly. Not disappear, but lift. My father was already there, of course. He stood near the main bar, one hand casually resting on Vanessa's lower back, laughing with a group of associates. He looked magnificent, silver-haired, tanned, radiating the kind of false confidence that comes from never believing consequences could touch him. Vanessa wore a white Valentino gown and diamond earrings. She held herself with the confidence of someone who believed she'd won. Her hand rested on my father's chest, possessive and deliberate. I took a breath, picked up a glass of water. I needed to stay sharp and began. I moved through the room with purpose, pausing at key tables. I sat next to the city councilwoman and quietly explained the full scope of my father's crimes. I showed her the documents. I answered her questions with calm precision. She grew visibly paler. "My God," she whispered. "And during his wife's final illness?" "Especially then," I said softly. I spoke to the venture capitalist next. He was a man my father had claimed as a close friend, a man who'd praised my father's integrity publicly. As I laid out the evidence of fraud in business dealings, transactions my father had misrepresented to him, the man's face flushed with anger, not at me, at the lies. By the time I approached the judge, the room had begun to buzz. People were glancing at my father. They were turning to one another with confused expressions. Questions were being asked in hushed tones. My father noticed. I saw the moment he realized something was wrong, a subtle tightening at the corners of his mouth, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Vanessa, sensing his unease, leaned closer, whispering something in his ear. He didn't respond. At precisely 8:45 p.m., Margaret Hartwell took the microphone and introduced me. We're delighted to have Clara Bennett with us this evening. Clara's mother, Victoria Bennett, served on our foundation board for 15 years and was one of our most passionate supporters. Clara, please come share some thoughts about your mother's legacy. I stood, my hand steady, and walked toward the stage. The string quartet ceased playing. The room quieted. I could feel every eye on me, including my father's. His expression was one of confusion mixed with irritation. He thought I was going to cry. He thought I was going to stumble through a grieving eulogy. He had no idea what was coming. I reached the microphone and smiled gently, not my mask smile, but something genuine and entirely serene. Thank you, Margaret, I began, my voice clear and carrying effortlessly through the ballroom. My mother believed in many things: kindness, integrity, the power of family, and the importance of truth. She dedicated herself to helping children with cancer because she understood suffering. And during her own illness, she learned something about character. I paused, letting that sink in. She learned who stood by her and who abandoned her. I turned slightly, my eyes finding my father in the crowd. His face had gone pale. Vanessa's hand had slipped from his chest. My mother passed away 8 months ago, I continued. While she was dying, certain family members prioritized personal gratification over her care. They also committed financial crimes against her estate. They stole from a dying woman to fund a lifestyle of excess. The room had gone absolutely silent. You could have heard a champagne flute drop. Over the next few minutes, I'll be sharing documentation of these crimes with authorities and with the press. I held up a folder, but I wanted those of you who know my father to hear this directly from me first. Not in a newspaper tomorrow, not in a courtroom, but here, now, from the only person in this room who loved the woman he betrayed. I clicked a remote control, and images appeared on the ballroom's large screens. Photographs of my father and Vanessa on the yacht, their passionate embraces, the timeline displayed across the images, dates showing he was there during my mother's final hospital admission. I spoke again, my voice never wavering. These are the documents my father submitted to claim fraudulent deductions. Statements appeared on the screens. These are the accounts he opened in Vanessa's name using my mother's inheritance. More documents. And these are the emails in which he and Vanessa discussed liquidating my mother's retirement accounts before her death was even announced. Gasps erupted through the room. Someone actually stood up, backing away from the bar in disgust. I looked directly at my father now. You taught me once that reputation is everything, that the world believes what you project, not what is true. You were wrong. The truth eventually becomes undeniable. A woman in the crowd began clapping. Just one person at first, then another, then several more. Not celebratory, respectful. The kind of applause offered to someone who has spoken truth to power. My father stood frozen, Vanessa's face a mask of horror beside him. I watched the realization dawn in his eyes, the comprehension that 8 months of his comfortable arrogance had been observed, documented, and was now being dismantled in front of the 400 people he most wanted to impress. Michael Torres appeared at the edge of the stage, camera in hand, recording everything. As security discreetly approached my father, apparently, Margaret had arranged this in advance, as I'd suspected she might. I stepped away from a microphone and walked down from the stage. The councilwoman was the first to greet me, grasping my hand. "That took tremendous courage," she said. "No," I corrected gently. "It took 8 months of patience. Courage is the thing my mother showed every single day she fought her illness. This was just justice." The next morning, the newspaper's headline read, "Local businessman accused of massive fraud and elder financial exploitation." Michael's article was thorough, precise, and devastating. He included statements from Eleanor about my mother's deterioration. He quoted Patricia, the lawyer, about the legal implications. He presented the financial evidence with clear graphics showing the theft. He even included a photograph of my father's face at the moment the screens displayed Vanessa's name in connection with the offshore accounts. By noon, 3 separate law enforcement agencies had opened investigations. The city councilwoman, true to form, had contacted the district attorney personally. The venture capitalist had filed a complaint about fraudulent business dealings. My father's law license, yes, he was a contract attorney, was under review by the Bar Association. Vanessa hired a lawyer and immediately began distancing herself, claiming she'd had no knowledge of the financial crimes. It didn't matter. The emails were irrefutable. My father attempted to mount a defense through his own counsel, claiming that as community property in our state, the funds were joint assets he had the right to use. But the timing, the obvious pattern of theft during my mother's decline, combined with the fraudulent documents, made the defense untenable. Within 3 months, my father faced charges including wire fraud, financial exploitation of the elderly, and theft by deception. Vanessa faced charges as an accomplice. I didn't attend the trial. I didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. What I did instead was donate the recovered funds, eventually returned to my mother's estate, to the Children's Cancer Research Foundation in her name, the Patricia Bennett Research Fund. I endowed it with enough capital to fund cancer research for the next 15 years. I also changed my life in smaller, quieter ways. I took time off from my job as a marketing consultant to focus on what truly mattered. I volunteered with a nonprofit that helped families navigate serious illness. I wrote an article, published under a pseudonym, about the emotional toll of being gaslit by a narcissistic parent. The piece went viral on a well-known blog, with thousands of readers recognizing themselves in my words. Eleanor, my mother's best friend, and I became even closer. I'd visit her on Sunday afternoons, and she'd tell me stories about my mother that I'd never heard. Stories that revealed the depth of my mother's character in ways her will and the charity fund never could. One evening, about 6 months after the gala, Eleanor sat across from me with a knowing smile. "Your mother would be so proud," she said. I set down my tea. "I'm not sure about that. I orchestrated a very public humiliation." "No," Eleanor corrected gently. "You told the truth. You gave a voice to someone who no longer could speak for herself. That's something entirely different." She was right. What I'd done wasn't revenge in the traditional sense. It wasn't cruel or vindictive. It was simply the natural consequence of someone's own actions, brought to light by patient, meticulous documentation. 18 months later, I stood in front of my apartment's mirror and barely recognized myself. Not physically, though my face had lost some of its tension, the lines that had etched themselves into my forehead finally easing. But internally, something fundamental had shifted. The girl who clutched her mother's scarf at a funeral, drowning in helplessness and rage, had transformed into something else entirely. A woman who understood that power isn't about domination. It's about clarity. It's about truth. It's about refusing to be erased by another person's arrogance. My father had been convicted on 3 counts of fraud and 1 count of financial exploitation. He faced 5 years in federal prison. Vanessa had taken a plea deal and would serve 18 months in minimum security. Their names were now permanently associated with betrayal and deception, but I didn't think about them often anymore. Instead, I thought about my mother, about the strength she'd shown in her final months, continuing to treat people with dignity even as my father abandoned her, about her words in that leather journal, "You are stronger than they ever imagined." She had been right. I had become the person she always knew I could be, not because I was cruel or vindictive, but because I refused to be small. I refused to be silenced. I refused to let cruelty win. I had walked through fire, the fire of grief, betrayal, and anger, and I had emerged on the other side, not destroyed but refined, shaped by truth, strengthened by patience. Eleanor had given me a small framed photograph for my apartment. It showed my mother at the Children's Cancer Research Foundation Gala 5 years prior, laughing freely, looking vibrant and alive. The Patricia Bennett Research Fund was now in its second year, and they'd already made significant breakthroughs in pediatric leukemia treatment. That was my mother's real legacy. Not the gala, not the scandal, not the convictions, but the work that continued in her name, helping children face the battles she had faced. I understood now that the best revenge isn't destruction. It's building something better. It's taking the pain and transforming it into meaning. It's allowing truth to speak for itself while you move on to something greater. My name is Clara Bennett. I am my mother's justice. I am my father's consequence. But more importantly, I am my own liberation. And in the quiet moments when I remember that rainy day at her grave, when I felt that hollow ache of abandonment, I smile, not with bitterness or satisfaction, but with peace, because I finally understand the most powerful thing I could ever do was simply tell the truth, and then walk away, head held high, knowing that I had honored the woman who raised me by refusing to become like the man who broke her. The rest took care of itself. I learned that night at the gala that respect is non-negotiable. My worth was never determined by the chair I sat in at family dinners, or by who my father believed I should become. It wasn't defined by his dismissal or her triumph. I discovered something far more powerful. Silence can be a weapon, and patience can be the greatest form of strength. When I stopped begging to be seen and simply documented the truth, everything changed. The girl he tried to erase became the woman who couldn't be ignored. If my story resonated with you, if you felt gaslit, diminished, or erased by someone you trusted, I want you to know this. Your silence doesn't make you weak. Your boundaries don't make you difficult. Your refusal to shrink makes you extraordinary. Share this with someone who's been convinced they're overreacting, who's apologized for taking up space, who's learned to make themselves small. Tell them what I'm telling you now. The revolution begins when you decide to write your own ending. Your worth was never in question. It was only ever waiting to be remembered. Subscribe and hit that notification bell for more stories about setting boundaries, reclaiming your power, and transforming humiliation into triumph. Because when you stop asking for permission and start documenting your truth, the world has no choice but to listen.